They laughed at concrete, until it was the only thing standing. The first thing I heard wasn't the rain. It was the glass. A sharp, hollow crack that echoed across the cul-de-sac like someone had dropped a plate on marble. Then came the low roar, water forcing its way through places it was never meant to go. I could smell it before I saw it, that thick mix of wet soil, asphalt, and something metallic riding the air. I was already outside, boots planted on top of the flood wall they'd called ugly, watching the street transform into a slow-moving river. My name is Ryan Calloway, and I knew this moment was coming down to the minute. The rain had been building all afternoon, heavy clouds stacking like concrete slabs across the sky, pressure dropping just enough that you could feel it in your chest if you knew what to look for. Most people didn't. The HOA definitely didn't. They were too busy worrying about curb appeal, symmetry, and whether my wall ruined the aesthetic. I remember the exact day they stood right where I'm standing now, dressed like they were heading to a garden party, smiling that polished kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "It looks industrial," one of them said, her voice light, almost amused, like something from a construction site. Another one laughed, short and sharp. "This isn't a flood zone, Mr. Calloway. This is a premium community." I didn't argue. I just nodded, the way you do when you realize someone has already decided what they believe. Because here's the thing about water, it doesn't care what you believe. It follows the grade. It respects gravity. And it always finds the lowest point. That night, I went back inside, pulled out the old survey maps my father kept rolled in a metal tube, edges worn from decades of being unrolled and studied. The paper smelled faintly like dust and oil, a reminder that this land had a memory long before Willow Creek Estates stamped its name on a sign at the entrance. 47 acres, give or take, sloping just enough to turn a heavy storm into a problem if you didn't manage it right. My wall wasn't decoration. It was control. 12 inches of reinforced concrete, anchored deep, calculated, down to the inch based on runoff projections and historical rainfall data that most people wouldn't even know how to read. I didn't build it to look pretty. I built it to hold. Back outside, the water was already creeping over the curb across the street, pooling where the drainage system dipped, because they had it redesigned 6 months ago. Improved flow, they said. Cleaner lines. I watched as the first garage door across from me shuddered under the pressure, the sound dull and heavy, like a drum being struck underwater. Someone shouted. Another voice answered, higher, panicked. The smell of wet drywall started to mix into the air. My wall stayed dry. Not a drop crossed it. The surface was cold under my hand, solid, unmoving, exactly as it was designed to be. I could feel the vibration of the water hitting the other side, a steady push that would have rolled straight through my property if I had listened to them. If I had cared more about how it looked than what it did. A car alarm started somewhere down the block, its electronic wail cutting through the storm like a warning that came too late. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching the system correct itself the only way it knows how. Because minutes ago, this was just rain to them. Just another storm rolling through a premium community. But I could already see the pattern forming, the way the water was being redirected, trapped by decisions made by people who never once asked how the land actually worked. And as the level kept rising, inch by inch, steady and unstoppable, I knew they were about to understand something they should have learned before they ever laughed. The water kept rising, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. I stepped down from the wall and walked along its length, my boots scraping against the rough concrete, the texture familiar under my palm. This was not guesswork. This was math. I remember standing in this exact spot 6 months ago, the sun high, the air dry, holding a measuring rod while the survey stakes cast thin shadows across the ground. Back then, it was quiet. Just the hum of distant traffic and the occasional click of a sprinkler system somewhere deeper in the neighborhood. That was before they changed everything. Willow Creek Estates was not built on stable ground. Not in the way they thought. It used to be a natural runoff basin, a place where stormwater spread out, slowed down, and sank into the soil over time. My father taught me that when I was 12, standing knee-deep in mud after a summer storm, pointing to the way water carved invisible paths across the land. He used to say, "You can ignore water, but it will never ignore you." The original drainage plan accounted for that. Wide channels, gradual slopes, retention zones hidden behind rows of trees. It was not pretty, but it worked. Then the HOA decided working was not good enough. They wanted symmetry, clean lines, a neighborhood that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. I still remember the meeting at the clubhouse, the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood, the way they passed around those glossy renderings like they were blueprints for perfection. They called it an upgrade. They narrowed the channels, paved over sections of open ground, and installed decorative grates that looked impressive but handled only a fraction of the original capacity. I sat in the back row, listening, watching them nod at each other like they had already solved a problem they did not understand. I raised my hand once. Just once. I explained the flow rate, the historical rainfall averages, the way the land naturally directed water through this exact section. I even showed them the numbers, printed clean on paper, simple enough for anyone willing to look. The room went quiet for about 3 seconds. Then someone cleared their throat, smiled, and said, "We appreciate your input, Ryan, but this has already been approved." Approved. That word stuck with me. Approved by people who had never walked the property after a storm. Approved by people who thought water followed design instead of gravity. Now, standing here in the dark with the rain coming down harder, I could see the result of that decision playing out in real time. The streetlights flickered as the water reached the base of the electrical boxes, reflections trembling across the surface like broken glass. Across from me, the driveway that used to slope gently away from the houses was now channeling everything straight toward them, a perfect path created by their own redesign. I crouched for a moment, running my hand just above the surface of the water pressing against my wall. It was higher than it should have been at this point in the storm. Not by much. Maybe 3 inches. But 3 inches was all it took to turn inconvenience into damage. I stood back up, looking down the line of houses, lights turning on one by one as people started to realize something was wrong. Doors opened. Voices carried through the rain, sharp and uncertain. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning of what they had set in motion. The rain intensified, each drop hitting the surface with a sharper edge, turning the steady rise into something more urgent, more deliberate. I could hear it now beneath everything else, that deep, rolling pressure as the system strained against limits it was never designed to handle. A porch light snapped onto my left, then another, warm yellow cutting through the gray haze. Someone stepped out, barefoot, pausing at the edge of their driveway as the water lapped closer to the concrete lip. "What is happening?" A voice called out, uncertain, almost disbelieving. I did not answer. I just watched. Because I had seen this pattern before, not here, but in places where people respected it. In floodplains, in controlled spill zones, in systems where every inch of elevation was accounted for. Here, it was guesswork wrapped in confidence. I walked back toward the center of my wall, the place where the grade dropped just enough to create a natural pressure point. I had reinforced this section twice during construction, adding extra rebar, thickening the base by another 4 inches. It was not visible from the street. They never noticed. That was the thing about function. It did not announce itself. It just held when everything else failed. Across the street, a garage door began to tremble under the weight of the water pressing against it from the outside. The sound was low and constant, like wind, pushing against a loose frame, except there was no wind. Just water, stacking inch by inch, finding the path they had unintentionally carved for it. I could see the reflection of headlights moving slowly at the far end of the block, someone trying to leave, tires cutting through water that was already halfway up the curb. The engine noise struggled, uneven, then steadied, then faded as they turned the corner. Smart move. Get out early, before the depth made that decision for you. I glanced down at the measuring marks I had etched into the inside edge of my wall, faint lines every inch, worn but still readable if you knew where to look. The water level was climbing faster now. Not dramatically, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. The redesigned drainage was backing up, not failing all at once, but choking gradually, like a pipe narrowing under pressure. I could almost map it in my head, each intersection, each narrowed channel, each decorative grate forcing more volume into less space. Another door opened somewhere behind me, then the sound of hurried footsteps on wet pavement. "Ryan," a voice called, closer this time. I turned slightly. It was Mark from 2 houses down, his jacket half-zipped, hair already soaked, eyes scanning the street like he was trying to make sense of something that refused to add up. Is this normal? He asked, gesturing toward the water, now pushing into the lower edges of the driveways. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the street. Not the way they built it, I said, my voice steady, even over the rain. He followed my line of sight, watching the water move, watching it gather where it should have dispersed. I could see the realization starting, slow and uncomfortable, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles in piece by piece. Behind him, another neighbor stepped out, then another, forming small clusters under porch lights, voices overlapping, questions stacking without answers. The air felt heavier now, thick with moisture and something else, something sharper, like the moment before a system gives way. I rested my hand against the concrete again, feeling the steady force on the other side. Unchanged, controlled, exactly where it should be. And as the water continued to rise where it should not, I knew the line between inconvenience and consequence had already been crossed. The sound changed before anything else did. It shifted from scattered impacts to a constant, layered noise, like the entire street had become one surface absorbing everything at once. I could hear doors opening faster now, voices sharper, less controlled. The kind of tone people use when they realize something is not just unusual, it is wrong. Mark stepped closer to the wall, squinting through the rain, trying to follow the line where the water stopped. His shoes were already soaked, darkened from the edges inward. How is it not crossing? He asked, more to himself than to me. I did not answer right away. Instead, I pointed down toward the base, where the concrete met the ground, where the sealant line sat just below the surface level. Because it has nowhere to go on this side, I said calmly. It was designed that way. He nodded slowly, but his eyes drifted back to the street, where the situation was no longer abstract. A mailbox down the block tilted slightly as water pooled around its base, the current beginning to shift direction as more runoff fed into the same confined space. The slope they had flattened for visual symmetry was now working against them, turning a gentle flow into a stalled buildup. I could see headlights flicker again, another car attempting to navigate through the rising water, the beam reflecting off the surface in broken lines. The engine sound struggled, pushing harder than it should have needed to, then stopped completely. Silence followed for a brief second, then the click of a door opening and someone stepping out, water immediately reaching their ankles. They hesitated, then moved faster, splashing toward higher ground. Behind me, more footsteps approached. I did not need to turn to know who it was. The perfume hit first, faint even through the damp air, sharp and controlled. Then the voice, tighter than I had ever heard it. Ryan, what is going on? I turned slowly. It was her, the HOA president, standing under a large umbrella that did nothing to hide the tension in her posture. Her shoes were not made for this, thin soles already darkened by the water creeping across the pavement. She looked past me at the wall, then back at the street, her expression trying to hold on to control while everything around her moved in the opposite direction. You said this could happen, she added, the words coming out faster now. Not a question, not yet an admission, just a statement she could not quite frame. I held her gaze for a moment, letting the rain fill the space between us. I said the drainage system would not handle this volume. I replied evenly. You chose a different design. Her grip tightened on the umbrella handle, knuckles pale against the dark fabric. She glanced over her shoulder, where more neighbors had gathered, their voices rising, overlapping, searching for direction that was not coming. The street light above us flickered again, reflecting off the water that had now reached the first step of several homes. It was subtle, but it was enough. Enough to shift concern into urgency. Enough to make every earlier decision feel closer, heavier. She stepped forward, closer to the wall, her eyes tracing its length as if seeing it for the first time. Can it hold? She asked, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier certainty. I rested my hand against the concrete again, feeling the steady, controlled pressure on the other side. The structure did not move. It did not flex. It simply existed, doing exactly what it was built to do. It is already holding, I said. And for the first time, she did not respond immediately. She just stood there, looking at the line that separated control from consequence. As the water continued to rise where it should not have been, the water reached the first step, and that was the moment everything shifted. It was no longer a question of if, but how far. I could see it in their faces, The way conversations stopped mid-sentence. The way people started moving with purpose instead of curiosity. Mark stepped back from the edge, wiping rain from his eyes, his voice tighter now. "It is getting into the houses," he said, not asking, just confirming what we could all see. Across the street, a front door opened wider, and someone began lifting boxes from just inside the entryway, stacking them higher, as if a few extra inches might make the difference. The smell in the air changed again, less like rain and more like soaked materials, wood and fabric beginning to absorb what they were never meant to hold. The HOA president turned sharply toward me, the earlier composure gone, replaced by something more direct, more urgent. "You need to do something," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the storm. I did not move. I kept my hand on the concrete, feeling the steady resistance, unchanged, controlled, exactly where it should be. "I already did," I replied. She stared at me, the words not landing the way she expected. "No, I mean now," she insisted, stepping closer, water splashing around her ankles. "There has to be a way to redirect it, to open something, to let it through." I followed her gaze back to the wall, then to the street, mapping the flow the way I always did, tracing invisible lines through visible consequences. "If I let it through," I said calmly, "it comes here." I tapped the top of the wall lightly. "Then it goes straight across my property, and from there it spreads back out. You would not be solving the problem. You would be moving it." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped, the logic catching up with the urgency. Behind her, more voices rose, sharper now, layered with frustration. Someone called out for sandbags. Another voice mentioned the drainage grates, saying they were blocked, that water was not moving the way it should. I closed my eyes for a brief second, picturing the layout beneath the surface, the narrowed channels, the decorative covers designed more for appearance than capacity. It was not blockage. It was limitation. They had reduced the system to something that looked efficient but could not scale when it mattered. I stepped down from the wall and walked a few feet along its length, crouching again near one of the lower sections where the pressure was highest. The water on the other side pressed hard, but it remained contained, the line holding exactly as calculated. I ran my fingers just above the surface, measuring without tools, instinct and experience filling in the gaps. Another inch, maybe two before it reached the critical point for the surrounding properties. Not for the wall, for everything else. I stood back up and looked at her again. The rain had flattened her hair, the umbrella now useless, hanging at her side. "You approved the redesign," I said, not accusing, just stating what was already part of the equation. "You reduced the outflow capacity and redirected the grate. This is where the water goes now." She shook her head slightly, as if rejecting the simplicity of it. "We were told it would improve drainage," she said, quieter this time, more to herself than to me. "It did," I answered, "under normal conditions." Another surge of water rolled down the street, subtle but enough to push the level higher against the doors and steps. A child's voice called from somewhere inside one of the houses, followed by hurried movement. The neighborhood that had once been silent and controlled now felt alive in the wrong way. Every sound sharper, every second carrying weight. I rested my hand on the concrete again, steady, unmoved, the only thing in this entire scene doing exactly what it was meant to do. And as the water continued to rise where it had been forced to gather, I could see the realization settling in, slow but undeniable. This was not a sudden disaster. This was a delayed consequence. The rain did not stop. It settled into a relentless rhythm, heavy and constant, like the sky had committed to the outcome. The waterline crossed the threshold of the first house, slow but undeniable, slipping past the door seal and spreading across the entry floor. I watched the reaction ripple outward, voices rising sharper now, footsteps quicker, people moving with urgency that came too late to prevent what had already started. Mark ran a hand through his soaked hair, pacing a few steps before turning back to me. "This is not just pooling anymore," he said, his voice tight. "It is coming inside." I nodded once. "It will keep coming until it finds a balance," I said. "Right now, it has nowhere else to go." Across the street, two neighbors were working together, stacking sandbags in a rough line, their movements fast but uncoordinated, each bag placed with more hope than strategy. The water pushed against them, slipping through gaps, curling around edges, ignoring the effort entirely. I could hear the strain in their breathing even from where I stood, the sound of effort meeting a force that did not respond to intention. The HOA president stepped closer again, her voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it had earlier. "There has to be something we can do to lower it," she said. Not a command this time. A request. I looked past her, tracing the path of the water through the redesigned channels, the way it backed up at each narrowed point, each decorative grate acting like a filter instead of a passage. I could see it clearly, the entire system mapped out in motion, every decision playing out exactly as it was always going to under this level of stress. "The system is at capacity," I said evenly. "It cannot move water out as fast as it is coming in." She shook her head again, but there was less resistance in it now, more disbelief than denial. "Then we need to open it up," she said. "Remove something. Break something. Just let it drain." I met her eyes, holding the moment steady. "That would require permits, equipment, and time," I said. "And even then, you would still be fighting the grade you created." Behind her, a loud splash cut through the air as someone stepped into a deeper section without realizing it, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The water was uneven now, deceptive in places, deeper than it appeared under the reflection of streetlights. I stepped along the wall again, checking the line, the height, the pressure. Still stable, still within design limits. The concrete held firm, unchanging against everything pushing against it. I crouched briefly, brushing my fingers along one of the measurement marks. Another inch gained. That made 5 since the start of the storm's peak. Not catastrophic on its own, but combined with everything else, it was enough. Enough to push past thresholds. Enough to turn design flaws into visible consequences. I stood back up and looked down the street. Again, the car that had stalled earlier was now half surrounded, water reaching the lower edge of its doors. Porch lights reflected in the surface, broken and distorted, like the neighborhood itself had lost its clean lines. The HOA president followed my gaze, her shoulders dropping slightly, the weight of understanding settling in. "You knew this would happen," she said quietly. I did not respond immediately. I let the rain fill the space again, steady, unchanging, like the system itself. "I knew what the land would do," I said finally. The rest was already decided. Another surge rolled through, subtle but enough to shift everything higher, pressing against doors, steps, foundations that were never meant to hold back water. And as the neighborhood adjusted to a reality it had never planned for, I stayed where I was, one hand on the only structure in sight that had been built to face this exact moment. The water was no longer creeping. It was claiming space. I could see it in the way it spread across living room floors through open doorways, reflecting ceiling lights in long, distorted streaks. The rain kept falling, steady and indifferent, like it had no stake in the outcome it was creating. Mark had moved back toward his house, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in short, sharp steps as he tried to explain something that did not make sense to someone who was not standing here. Around him, others were doing the same, voices overlapping, each one searching for help that would arrive too late to change the first impact. I stayed by the wall. I always did when things reached this point. Not because I needed to, but because I understood what I was watching. The system was not collapsing. It was correcting. Every shortcut, every assumption, every decision made for appearance over function was now being translated into reality, inch by inch. The HOA president stood a few feet away, no longer trying to direct anyone, no longer holding that posture of control. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in the way people do when certainty leaves them all at once. Her eyes moved from the water to the houses to the wall, back and forth, like she was trying to find a version of this moment where the outcome was different. "If we had left it the way it was," she said quietly, almost to herself, "would this still be happening?" I let the question sit for a second, not because I needed time to answer, but because she needed time to hear it. "No," I said finally. "It would have spread out. Slower. Lower. Manageable." She nodded once, a small movement, but it carried more weight than anything she had said earlier. Behind her, one of the sandbag lines gave way slightly, water pushing through a weak point and widening it without resistance. The effort had not been wrong. It had just been too late. I walked a few steps along the wall again, scanning the line, checking the height against the marks. The rise was slowing now, not because the rain had eased, but because the system had reached a temporary balance point. The water had filled every available low space. It had nowhere else to go without a change in flow. That was the moment most people misunderstood. They thought the danger passed when the rise slowed. In reality, that was when the consequences settled in. I crouched again, placing my hand just above the waterline, feeling the steady pressure that had not changed since the storm peaked. The wall did exactly what it was built to do. It held the line. It redirected force. It created a boundary where there would have been none. I stood up and looked down the street one more time. The stalled car sat silent, half surrounded, its reflection broken by ripples that moved slower now. Porch lights glowed in windows where people moved inside, lifting what they could, adjusting to a situation they had never planned for. The HOA president stepped closer to the wall, close enough now to reach out, her fingers hovering just above the concrete before finally touching it. She held it there for a second, as if trying to understand it through contact alone. "We tried to make it better," she said, her voice barely carrying over the rain. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the intent. "You made it look better," I said. "That is not the same thing." She did not argue. She did not correct me. She just stood there, hand resting against the one structure that had not failed, watching the water sit where it had been forced to stay. And in that moment, with the rain still falling and the neighborhood reshaped by its own decisions, the difference between design and reality was no longer something you could debate. It was something you could see. The rain began to ease, not stopping, but softening just enough that you could hear everything else again. Doors opening, water shifting, the quiet, steady sound of people moving through spaces that no longer felt the same. The level had stopped climbing, not because the system recovered, but because it had reached its limit. Every low point was filled. Every mistake had taken shape. I stepped off the wall and onto my side of the property, dry ground under my boots, the difference immediate and absolute. I turned back and looked across the line, the contrast sharp enough that you did not need measurements to understand it. On one side, standing water stretching across driveways and into homes. On the other, controlled runoff, guided exactly where it was supposed to go. The HOA president followed me with her eyes, then stepped around to the end of the wall where the elevation dropped just enough for her to cross onto my side. She hesitated before stepping over, as if the line itself meant something more now. When she reached me, her voice was lower, steadier, but stripped of anything that sounded like authority. "We need to fix this," she said. "Not tonight. Not right now. Just the statement of what had to come next." I nodded once, because she was finally asking the right question, even if it was too late to change what had already happened. "It can be fixed," I said, "but not by adjusting the surface." I pointed back toward the street, toward the water that still sat where it had been forced to collect. "You have to restore the flow, widen the channels, remove the restrictions. Let the land do what it was built to do." She looked back over her shoulder, taking in the scene again, but this time her eyes moved differently, slower, more deliberate, tracing the path of the water instead of just reacting to it. "And the wall?" she asked after a moment. I rested my hand on the concrete again, feeling the faint vibration still present, though reduced now that the peak had passed. "The wall stays," I said. "It is not the problem." She nodded, not arguing, not questioning, just accepting something she had once dismissed. Behind us, a truck pulled into the far end of the street, headlights cutting through the damp air. Someone had called for help. It had arrived, but it would be dealing with the aftermath, not preventing it. A few neighbors began moving toward it, voices calmer now, more focused, shifting from reaction to response. Mark approached again, his phone lowered, his expression tired but clearer. "They are sending a crew in the morning," he said, glancing between me and the HOA president. "Inspection, drainage assessment, all of it." I nodded. That was the part most people did not see. The reports, the measurements, the documentation that turned what felt like an accident into something defined, something traceable. The HOA president looked at me again, holding my gaze for a second longer than before. "You have all the data, do not you?" she asked. I could still picture it, every survey, every calculation, every email I had sent that had been acknowledged and set aside. "Yes," I said simply. She took a slow breath, the kind people take when they realize the next step is not optional. "We are going to need it," she said. I did not respond right away. I looked back at the street one more time, at the water sitting exactly where it had been forced to stay, at the homes built on assumptions that had not held. Then I looked down at the wall, solid, unchanged, doing its job without explanation or apology. And in that moment, with the storm easing and the consequences settling into place, it was clear that what happened next would not be decided by opinion or appearance. It would be decided by facts, measurements, and the simple reality of how the land worked. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, gray light replacing the last of the storm, revealing everything the darkness had softened. The water was still there, sitting heavy across the street, but it had settled, no longer rising, no longer moving with urgency. It just existed now, quiet and undeniable. I stood where I had been for most of the night, one hand resting on the wall, feeling the difference in pressure as the system finally eased. The concrete was still solid, still unmoved, exactly as it had been when I poured it. Across from me, doors were open wide, people moving in and out with slow, deliberate steps, carrying what they could, adjusting to what they could not change. The smell had shifted again, less like rain, more like soaked wood, fabric, and the faint trace of something electrical that had been pushed too far. Mark walked over, boots wet, jeans darkened halfway up his calves, his movements slower now, measured. "Water is starting to drain," he said, nodding toward the far end of the street where the level had dropped by maybe an inch. Not much, but enough to show direction. Enough to show that the system, broken as it was, still followed the same rules. I nodded once. "It always does," I said. "Just not the way you expected." He let out a quiet breath, looking back at his house, then at the others, the clean lines of the neighborhood now marked by something they could not design away. The HOA president stepped out from one of the houses, no umbrella this time, no attempt to control how she looked. Just standing there, taking it in without filters. She walked toward me, stopping a few feet from the wall, her eyes moving along its length again, but differently now. Not judging, measuring. "The inspectors will be here in an hour," she said. "County, engineering, and legal." She paused, then added, "They asked specifically about prior warnings." I met her gaze, steady, unchanged. "I documented everything," I said. "Surveys, flow projections, capacity limits, emails, dates and timestamps." She nodded slowly, like each word had weight now, like each piece of information had already started to connect into something larger. "We are going to need all of it," she said again. But this time it sounded less like a request and more like an understanding of what came next. I looked back at the street, at the waterline marking every decision that had led here. It was clear, even without tools, even without reports. The path of the water told the entire story. Where it had been forced, where it had been blocked, where it had been misunderstood. The wall behind me stood clean, dry on one side, marked on the other by the exact height the storm had reached. A perfect record, written in inches instead of words. I stepped away from it and walked a few feet along the edge, tracing the line one last time, committing it to memory even though I already knew it would not change. This was the kind of evidence you did not argue with. You did not reinterpret it. You just acknowledged it. Behind me, vehicles began to arrive, tires pushing through shallow water, people stepping out with clipboards and equipment, their movements efficient, practiced. They did not look surprised. They rarely did. They looked at patterns, not events. The HOA president watched them approach, then looked back at me. "We thought we were improving things," she said, her voice quiet but clear. I did not respond immediately. I let the moment sit, the sound of water slowly receding, the quiet activity of people beginning to deal with what remained. Then I glanced back at the wall, at the one structure that had not changed, had not failed, had not needed to be reconsidered. "You improved how it looked," I said finally. "But the land does not care how it looks." She held that for a second, then nodded once, not arguing, not defending, just accepting. I turned toward my property, dry ground still firm under my feet, the line still clear behind me. The storm was over. The explanation had already been written. And as the first official measurements began, clipboards filling with numbers that would match everything I had already calculated, one thing was certain. This was never about the rain. It was about the decisions made long before it started. And now, for the first time, those decisions had nowhere left to hide.